Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Furlong, and today we're talking about learning! Humans aren't the only organisms that can learn. There's all kinds of animals that can learn. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at some of these different types of learning. The first type is innate learning. Now you might more commonly refer to this as instincts. Oftentimes we see an animal's instincts kick in response to a specific stimulus. Now these are behaviors that the organism is born with. And so scientists are always looking to see, well, what are behaviors that an individual is born with? What are behaviors that an individual learns? In humans, we have very few instinctual behaviors. One of them is we can start to swallow as soon as we are born so that we can start eating it right away. But scientists have done all kinds of different experiments on learning. And an interesting one was putting a kitten on a ledge. So here's a picture. They wanted to find out if a kitten would know that it's in danger. So they put this kitten right on the ledge to see if it would walk off the ledge or if it would back away. And as you can see, the kitten is peering over the ledge and it backed away. So is this an instinctual behavior? Were they born with that? They did the same thing with babies. Yeah, they put a baby right on the edge to see, well, would it crawl over and fall off the edge or would it back away? I don't know if you might have guessed, but the baby crawled over the edge. Oh, now, before you get too upset about this, they did have a little bit of plexiglass covering it so the baby wouldn't actually fall. But what I find incredible about this is that these instinctual behaviors are encoded in the DNA. So we know that DNA, not only does it code for traits and proteins, but it can also encode for behaviors as well. For instance, this is a picture of a robin's nest. All robins will make the same type of nest. Even if you were to take those eggs out of the nest, hatch them, raise the chicks yourself, those adult robins would know how to build that same exact nest, even though it's never seen how it's been made before. That behavior is encoded in their DNA, which I think is pretty amazing. What we're going to be focusing on are learned behaviors. So most types of behaviors are learned. These are responses that an individual develops as a direct result of a specific environmental experience. Now there's different types of learned behaviors. Some are very simple, some get to be more complex. So let's take a look at these. The first one is called habituation. And if you look closely, you see the root word is habit. Keep that in mind. Habituation is the loss of old responses, or you're kicking the habit, so to speak. Here, individuals can learn to ignore a response. For example, not hearing a sound. So let me give you an example of this. When I was a young kid, my parents bought a grandfather clock. And every 15 minutes, it would start to chime. And every hour, it would play a song. Well, the first couple nights that we had this, and the house was quiet, I would hear the chiming going off every 15 minutes. At the top of every hour, I would hear the song go off, and it was constantly waking me up. Well, after a few weeks, I stopped hearing it. In fact, one day I was standing right next to it and it started playing that song. And I realized, I haven't heard that song in weeks. So I learned to ignore that response. You may experience this too. People that live close to airports, eventually they stop hearing all the planes coming in. Or people that live close to railroad tracks, eventually they stop hearing the sound of the trains. It's habituation. You're ignoring that response. The next type of learning is called a conditioned reflex, or what we more commonly refer to simply as conditioning. So in conditioning, we have patterns of innate behaviors are being changed. Remember, innate means instinctual. So we're changing an instinctual behavior. So here's an actual definition. A behavior is evoked by a previously neutral stimulus which has been associated with the stimulus that causes the reflex. So I'll give you a chance to write that down. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. An example of this is Pavlov's dogs. So here you can see a setup of what Pavlov did with these dogs. Now, dogs as well as people, when they smell their food and they see their food, In order to get ready to eat it, they start to salivate. This is what is known as the cephalic stage of digestion. Anyways, every day Pavlov would bring the food out to the dog. The dogs would see the food, they would smell the food, they would start to salivate. But at the same time, he would ring a bell. Next day, he would bring out the food, the dogs would see the food, they would smell the food, they start to salivate, and he would ring a bell. Eventually, all he had to do was ring the bell, and the dogs would begin to salivate, even though there was no food around. So you see, he took a behavior that was evoked by a previously neutral stimulus. That was the bell. Before, bells had nothing to do with dogs salivating, but he now associated that with the time that the dogs were going to be fed. And so now when they heard the bell, they knew that food was coming, and they started to salivate. Hence, they were conditioned.
Oh, damn. Lost another file. Gonna have to reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid?
What do you think?
In school, we learned about this scientist who trained dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell by feeding them whenever a bell rang. So for the past couple weeks, I've been conducting a similar experiment. Dwight, want an Altoid?
Okay.
Altoid?
Sure.
And Dwight?
Vinpert? Yes.
What are you doing? What?
I don't know. Well, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden.
Oh.
The next type of learning is called imprinting. Imprinting is a learned behavior, but it does have an innate component to it. It has to be acquired during a limited period early in life. Now, a very good example of this, and I'm sure you've seen this before, is ducks. You know, the little ducklings, they always follow mom wherever she goes, and they'll walk right behind her. You see, when these ducklings were hatched, the first thing they saw, they associated with mom. And so, whatever they saw, this is mom, we're going to follow mom wherever she goes. And sometimes mom can get into some very dangerous places and, ooh. Well, anyways, a scientist wanted to see if this is true. So he took some ducklings and took the mom away, and he would always wear these bright red rubber rain boots. And one day the ducklings started to hatch, and he had these bright red rubber rain boots on. Well, when the ducklings hatched, the first thing they saw were these bright red rubber rain boots, and they thought, Mom. So whenever he walked around with those rain boots on, the ducklings followed right behind. Now, it's always been thought that is there some kind of imprinting that takes place in humans? And one idea has been this idea of language, that we have to learn a language when we are young. And that if we don't learn how to speak by a certain age, that we never will be able to. The problem was there's no way you could ever test that. Well, there was one case, this was out in California, where the parents basically took their two kids, they had a son and a daughter, and they put them in separate closets and did not talk to them. They would throw food under the door. They would bark at them like dogs. And when Child Protective Services came in and they found these kids, they didn't know how to talk. Now the girl, the oldest daughter, she was about 14, whereas the boy was around 9 or 10. They started to try to teach them how to talk. Now the girl, although she could start to learn words, really could not put more than about 3 or 4 words together to form a sentence. Whereas the boy, he was able to eventually start to learn how to talk and put much larger sentences together. So you see, the time for the girl to have learned how to speak had passed, that part of the brain that is associated with language had developed to the point where now she can't learn a language. And so really, when you start thinking about it, the best time to learn maybe a second language is when you're learning the first language, when you're younger. So now you think, well, why do we have to take, say, Spanish in high school? Well, here's the thing. Once you learn a language and you have a basis, you can learn as many languages as you want. You just have to decide that you want to learn those. Next type of learning is trial and error learning. This is when an organism faces a new and a difficult situation, maybe they face a new problem. And this is a type of learning that occurs when we end up making mistakes, we repeat over and over again, and when we do that, our errors eventually reduce. A classic example of this, a guy by the name of Edward Thorndike. He took a hungry cat, placed it inside a puzzle box, and it put a plate of fish just outside the box, where it was impossible for the cat to get to the plate unless it could open the door and get out. Now, Thorndike had arranged the puzzle box so that the cat either had to pull a loop or press down a lever which would open the door. So you can imagine initially the cat started just moving randomly inside the box. It started biting and clawing at the bars. It started to try to get its paws through those bars to squeeze out of the box. After several minutes of trying all of these different types of responses, the cat accidentally pulled on the loop. Having hit the correct response, though, the cat managed to get out and then was awarded with a small piece of fish. So the next day, the cat's hungry again. They put the cat back inside the box. This time, however, it took a lot less time for the cat to realize, if I pull this loop, I get out. They did this day after day after day. Now, eventually what happened was, as soon as they put the cat in the box, pulled the loop, got out. Hence, trial and error learning.
But how is a new skill learned? That was a question which began to fascinate Thorndike. To answer it, he built some ingenious puzzle boxes from which cats could only escape by operating latches.
And in you go.
The cat appears to be very clever in engineering its escape, solving the problem with a deftly placed paw and a push of its nose. But Thorndike didn't believe that an animal, even a clever cat, understands the consequences of its behavior. When he placed a cat in the puzzle box for the first time, Thorndike was unable to see any evidence of flashes of insight. The successful actions appeared first by chance. He proved that the apparent cleverness arose by trial and error, and used graphs to measure the rate of learning. A well-practiced cat quickly recalls the actions that help it escape to its reward of food. If an action brings a reward, Thorndike believed that that action becomes stamped into the mind. In his thesis, he explained further his ideas about learning, that behavior changes because of its consequences. He called this his law of effect, which explained how even wild creatures develop new habits.
The next type of learning is latent learning, which is learning that occurs naturally. There's no reward for this type of learning. It's just this part of learning that takes place on a daily basis. An example of this are rats in a maze. So they put a rat in a maze, timed how long it would take for the rat to get through. Put the rat back in the next day, timed how long it took to get through. They did this time after time after time. What they found was that the amount of time it took for the rat to get through the maze wasn't changing, it was staying level. So one day they put a piece of cheese at the end. The rat cut its time in half. Now, did the rat all of a sudden figure out how to get through the maze? No. It knew how to get through there from all the previous trials. It had no reason to get through the maze, right? But now that there was a piece of cheese there, it knew its way through and it got to the end of the maze very quickly. Another example of latent learning, for instance, is, let's say maybe you got your driver's license this year and for the first time you got to drive to school. Did you have to go online and go on to Google Maps and figure out how do I get to school? Of course not. You knew how to get here already, even though you've never driven here yourself before. Just by coming here all the time, you knew the best route to get from home to school. Latent learning. Now the last type of learning is by far the most complex. This is a form of reasoning that's going to draw upon our past experiences. This is by far the highest form of learning. Not all animals have the ability to have insight learning. Certainly, humans aren't the only ones, but there is a limited number that have the ability to have insight learning. So we are able to reason out problems based on these past experiences. And sometimes it may not even be a direct experience. So let me give you an example. Again, let's say you got your driver's license and it's the first weekend that you have it. You ask your parents to borrow their car and they said, sure, you can go out with your friends, just be back by midnight. And then all of a sudden, you show up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Now I bet that you can figure out what your parents would do in that case. It's never happened before, but you know what would happen. Insight learning.
At the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, Germany, psychologist Joseph Cole places a peanut inside a clear tube. How can the chimpanzee get the snack? She's never seen this puzzle before.
For 10 minutes, there is no solution inside. And all of a sudden, boom, they solve it. They have to understand that they can use the water as a tool. This is interesting because the water itself, it doesn't have any shape.
Using water as a tool seems like something we would do on a good day.
Most of the learning that takes place, for instance, in a school, this is all insight learning. These are the highest forms of learning that a person can do. So we're going to be doing some activities looking at these different types of learning, and I'll see you in class.